Good evening, everyone. I think a few people are still joining, but we can start. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are on Zoom or watching later on YouTube. I'll be very brief because no need to explain the significance of this date, our genocide commemoration event. And every year we select a specific topic at the Armenian Institute we focus on. Last year we talked about our neighbors, the year before about art inspired by genocide. And this year we're talking with two fantastic scholars about how women were targeted and gender aspects of genocide. The event is presented by Rebecca Jinks and Anna Arutshyan, and many of you will know Becky Jinks as the Armenian Institute's wonderful chair, but she's also a scholar and she's teaching comparative genocide at Royal Holloway University. And she will talk more about Anna, introduce her research. Anna and Becky will be in conversation with each other, and then all of you will have a chance to ask your question in the chat. Leave your comments, share your thoughts. We're always happy to hear what you think. What are your thoughts about topics we discuss? Tell us where you're joining from, and however bitter and sad the topic is, enjoy the event. And we're all reminded every year how important it is to talk about genocide, ethnic cleansing, oppression, discrimination, and I'm talking with a very, very heavy heart tonight because we've just heard the news that Osman Kavala has been imprisoned for life in Turkey, which is an extremely upsetting and disturbing news. So a lot of good thoughts and energy sent to his way. So I'll stop talking now. The event is being recorded, by the way. If you don't want to be seen, please turn your videos off. And everyone is on mute, but your questions will be read and we'll try to answer as many as possible from the chat. I'll stop now and invite Becky and Anna to join.
Thanks, Tato. I'm just going to introduce Anna briefly. I first met Anna, which is entirely pertinent to this topic actually, when I was on a scholarship in Yerevan in 2011. It was that long ago, Anna, when you introduced me to Armenia, Armenian culture, everything. I was at the Genocide Museum for about a month, and you were one of the people assigned to kind of look after me, check that I didn't get lost, mostly, and sort of disappear into the ether. But also, while I was there, that's where I found the photograph albums in the archives there that kicked off my own work on the absorption of Armenian women during the genocide. So we've kept up a bit of a relationship since, seen each other off and on. You moved to Clark University in the States in 2014 to start your PhD on women, gender and the Armenian genocide. And you've just told me you're about to defend in August, so I'm super excited for you. I mean, that's a sort of a brief intro to how I came to this topic, but I know you well enough, but tell us, like, what brought you to this topic? What made you pick this particular one, start studying it?
Mm-hmm. Hi, everyone. First, I want to thank Datev and also Becky, all of you for today's event. It is very important for me and also for the history, for Armenian history. How I came to this topic. So I was afraid of the word Armenian genocide because my family, from my mother's side, they are survivors, genocide survivors. So the topic was kind of a taboo in our family. But whenever I will visit my grandma, try to talk to her about this, she would have kind of either ignore me or change the conversation. And then when I was at the university, once she opened up and told me the story, how her family survived. And I was shocked to learn that their survival of their family was very much connected to her grandma, who basically killed a Turkish officer to save her family. So she killed a Turkish officer who came to her house demanding one of the women of household. All men were gone. They were either killed or she doesn't know, my grandma doesn't know the details, but she was like, the story that she shared was obvious that men were already absent and the day of deportation was already known, and their family was preparing for the journey. And her grandma, negotiating with this officer who came to negotiate, asking one of the women from the household, saying, oh, if you give me one of these women, then I will look after you during the deportation. And you have to know that all of you are going to be killed, but at least I will take care of you. So then this woman decided to kill him, to hide his body, and to also try to escape with her family. They were all women with small children, and they were traveling during the night, and they were hiding during the day. So it was kind of an astonishing, surprising story for me, because my mother's mother family, my grandma's family, they come from Mush, and they are very traditional. And women in, those of you who come from Mush, you know that probably that women in Masheti women, they are very shy. They would not allow themselves to talk when a man in man presence. And I was really shocked how this woman took the leadership and decided to save her family. And also it was shocking for me to learn that she could manage to save her family, and they could reach in a point that they were safe. They could basically cross the Eastern Armenian border somehow from Mush, not having GPS, anything. They could travel. It was astonishing for me, hiding during the day, being afraid that children are going to scream or make a noise, and all these stories. So I was shocked to learn about it. And when I was about to graduate from my master degree at the Yerevan State University, and I was working, I'm a historian, I was working on Russian history. So one of my professors became a director of Genocide Museum, and he learned that I want to kind of know more about Ottoman Armenian history. He was like, okay, maybe Genocide Museum is a place for you. You may come do your research. I went there, I started my research, I became tour guide in the beginning, and then I started to learn more about Ottoman Armenians. But again, I was afraid to go to details to, this genocidal process. So I was afraid to discover more, because whenever I was coming across with these stories working at the Genocide Museum, I was like avoiding them, because my grandma, her family, they were coming. I mean, their pictures were coming, and I was like afraid, let's say, for my own family past, I mean, what they went through. And in the beginning, I was studying Ottoman Armenian life before the genocide, and it helped me a lot, because I became familiar with these people who were there, how they were living, and what they were before the genocide. And then I shifted my topic and tried to work on after genocide period, when this reconstruction started. I was working on rescue mission of Armenians. I was particularly working on Arpine Haroyan and how he was trying to save Armenian women and children. And then I was like, no, I have to go to genocide. I have to study the process to make a picture complete for me, and then to understand. I mean, who I already knew who were they before the genocide, and I already saw the problems in post-genocide Armenian society. So I was like, I have to study to understand in between and to see what happened with these people during the genocide and how they managed to survive, those who managed to survive, and why it was so difficult for most of them to become part of this reconstruction. They became part of the reconstruction, but so they had many difficulties. So I was, that was the main, I would say that was the short story how I came to this topic. Yeah. So.
Sounds like a process of kind of avoiding and circling until finally accepting that the taboo or the thing that you were afraid of had to be done. But I think that's really interesting because one of the things that strikes me so much about gender and genocide, and I'm a comparative person as well as someone who works on Armenia, is that gender is a social construct, and genocide tends to reconfigure how gender works in a society or in a community. And it's not static. It doesn't just get replicated afterwards. So I think in a way, the way that you've done it is the right way, to be able to kind of see that. I mean, perhaps we can talk about that and open it up a bit more. That some of my work has been on, international humanitarians landing on the Near East, then it was called, in the early 1920s, and doing their best to reconstruct the Armenian nation. But you've looked at it very much from an internal community perspective, like you're saying, rescue missions and so on. The difficulties of reconstruction were so many, right? There's trauma, there's resources, there's economics, there's a breakdown of religion, there's families scattered everywhere. But in what ways do you see gender working there? Like, how did it affect masculinity? How did it affect femininity? Perhaps we're starting back to front because we're talking about the end at the beginning, but let's carry on with that.
So I would start with again with pre-genocide Armenian community, Ottoman Armenian community. When I was starting, even being a historian, even reading about Armenian history, it was surprising for me to discover how diverse Ottoman Armenians were in the Ottoman Empire. Listen, Armenians, Vanetsi Armenians, Masheti Armenians, Harpertsi Armenians, Sivassi Armenians, Trabzonsi Armenians, all these Armenians, they were Armenians. They had this, common, they considered themselves Armenians. They had, some cultural, unity, but at the same time they were very diverse. The local identity of Ottoman Armenians was very strong, and if you travel like region by region, you would see how different they were. They were talking different dialects, they had different garments, and intergender dimensions were also somehow different region by region. I have mentioned Mush. So Masheti Armenians were very traditional. They were resisting any new things coming to their region. For example, opening schools for girls. They were almost killed Khrimian Hayrik, who was one of the prominent Armenian leaders back then, only because he initiated to open a school for girls. But we see in other regions, for example, in Sivas, how women were going to these girls' schools. They were graduating and then continuing their education abroad. They were going to Europe, the US, coming back. And so it was changing in Armenian. Also, this activity of women was changing Ottoman Armenian community. It was making Armenian women more visible. Mm-hmm. And but when genocide started, okay, we see how these women, where they were in their education, social status, the responses to genocidal crimes were different. Mm-hmm. And this is where we see how these intergender dimensions inside Armenian communities changed during the genocide, because Armenian men, okay, before the genocide, very patriarchal Armenian society, even Armenian women were trying to gain their place. They were trying to participate in some processes, but at the same time, it was a patriarchal society. And men were responsible for family. Men were decision makers. But in the very beginning of genocide, most of men were gone. They were physically killed. Mm-hmm. And women were, they left without this protection. Those men who were still with them were pretty much demasculinized during the genocide, dehumanized, and women then took the role of decision makers. We see how it is changing. We read in the memoirs of survivors. For example, if you take Aram Andonyan, one of the famous survivor, who was the one who collected, he was basically one of the first who collected the survivors' testimonies, right? And he would, mention this, how men were, they were not decision makers. Mm-hmm. So women became decision makers. And because women became decision makers, this helped them, most of them, to survive and to protect rest of their family members if they could, including male members of family. But the way they did it, of course, at the end, turned against them. For example, some women became prostitutes, and they were, providing with the food for their family. But when genocide was over, when war was over, let's say, community knew, family members knew, and they were ashamed of their of these women, and they disappear. So we do not read about them, we do not see them, but they were the ones who were helping their family members also to survive. This is why, for example, when we look at these gendered aspects of genocide, we can see these layers of genocide, both from the perspective of perpetrators organizing different ways of the destruction, and also survivors trying to survive, changing the dynamics within their own group, gender dynamics. So,
Yeah, that's brilliant. I think you've already kind of broken it down hugely, which is brilliant. I was just thinking about, when I asked my students at the start of each class, like, okay, let's run through what happened. And I was reflecting earlier on the way that, especially with this genocide and the other highly gendered ones where men, mostly military age men, are targeted first, the narration of the genocide is often gendered from the start. First they killed the men, and they did this to the women. The standard story, with this case is always that first they kill the men, then the women, the elderly and the kids are deported. It's all sorts of privations and abuse and murder and sexual violence en route. Then my students don't quite know what's happened after that, because I don't think they've quite caught up with the scholarship, but we're getting there. So the telling of this is gendered from the beginning, but I like the way that you've broken it down regionally. I think that's really important. And also because it kind of implies that, in a perverse kind of way, the genocide is a leveler, because all women, no matter whether they've been shy or educated, whatever the class position was before the genocide, became decision makers, like you said. And there's that, it opens up these histories of resistance, and I think it allows historians to bring in agency in a way that we often downplay. I think it's not just a history of this being done to these people and they were completely helpless. There are stories here of, like, a grandmother's grandmother, or other women resisting by throwing themselves, off a cliff, if that's what they felt they had to do. So this perspective, I think, also helps us kind of bring out those stories and that victim agency in a different way. So I think that's something quite important here. I mean, that's the usual story, and you touched on one of the taboos of this topic earlier, I think, which is prostitution, as well as, talking about the taboo in your family as well. Should we talk about arranged marriages, or sorry, not arranged, fixed marriages a bit more as well, as the kind of corollary to that?
Yeah, I mean, so I would talk about forced marriages being part of genocidal program, because, as we know, in this kind of genocide, men physically would be killed, and women, they would choose different ways. The methods to destroy also in women was this forced marriage institution, which sexual violence was there from the very beginning of genocide, you know that. And this sexual violence, rape, also was used to force these women to become wives of Muslim men who were allowed to take these women as their wives from the very beginning, right? So, what happened, as we read, for example, Professor Arutshyan, Anna Arutshyan brings these documents from Ottoman archives. When we read that from the very beginning, instigators of genocide were encouraging local perpetrators to choose and legally marry, especially women and girls from wealthy families. First and foremost, it was the way to legally become owners of their property, right? First, they kill their male family members, and then they take these women as their wives, or their daughters, their wives, and then this way become legal owners of their property. So this was used to legalize plunder, I would say. And it was in a very beginning of deportation. So, but some women would resist, and they would hide their identity. Also, they would try to avoid these marriages. And interestingly enough, we see how from person to person their stories change. And what I found most interesting that sometimes, for example, in one story of survival, that we see the Kurdish man is a perpetrator and Turkish man becomes savior because he saves this woman from, for example, from that man, and takes care of her and marries her, and this also happened. And after the genocide, we see, after the war, when it was possible to come back, we see that some women would reject to come back to Armenian community, or to be rescued, to come back to their older life. And they had different reasons for that. But there were cases also that they were happy with these Muslim families. Within these Muslim families, they had already children, they were treated well, and they were afraid to come back to this unknown, uncertain environment that they didn't know what is going to happen next. So many women and girls were forced to become wives of, I'm saying Muslim, but because many nationalities were involved, so I'm generalizing. So, and of course, they were forced to change their names. They became Muslim. They could not practice Christianity, so, and also they could not have any connection with other Armenian. That was also one of the conditions. So they were losing their Armenian identity, but it was also a way for physical survival. Some women would bear this because, not all of them were lucky. They were, in these forced marriages, they were victims of constant rape. Also, they were forced to do all the heavy work, and of course, they were, their family members were killed, and so they were second-class people in that household, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, they were ready to bear it, waiting for the right moment to escape, to survive. And when genocide was over, it turned out that most of survivors are women and children, but these women and children were in the Muslim households. And this is where we face these difficulties when, for example, both Armenian and the international community were trying to rescue them, to reconstruct the Armenian community. This is where we see how these women would choose not to come back, would choose not to leave their Muslim, their children that they had from Muslim men. Even having this understanding of that they live within perpetrators' community, because sometimes they didn't have even the understanding, right? Because they could not see the bigger picture. These women were sometimes were children when they had the genocide started, and they became women. They didn't know that they could not see the bigger picture. Some could, but most could not. And so even having this understanding of what happened to them, who is responsible, and it is the complete destruction of Armenians, and they would not easily come back, let's say, to Armenian community.
Yeah, it had to be an ambivalent process, didn't it? I mean,
yeah.
if people knew where you had been, I mean, I think a lot of scholarship has started to explore how the community is shifting after communities definitely are shifting, and that's important, isn't it, the region after the genocide. But like you say, for those who did have a conception of this, the apprehension of how people would have treated you, of whether you would be able to marry again or marry, whether you would be accepted, is something that will have stopped a lot of women from wanting to join. So that makes sense. And I think one of the interesting things about this scholarship on post-genocide reconstruction actually is some of Lena Efeksiolu's work on the Istanbul feminist community. And I'm saying that in part because because her work is great, but also because it's a really interesting geopolitical moment as well. When numbers matter, and the League of Nations is deciding the fate of Armenia, as it were, and larger numbers is makes you a larger nation, and therefore gives you more right to land. So I think that's if we're talking about shifting gender constructs and Armenian nationalism as it's kind of reconfigured by the experience of war and genocide, it's interesting watching how at least part of the community is advocating for the return of these women to help out, in part for humanitarian reasons, but also with an eye to that kind of geopolitical sort of moment. I think we see this in other genocides as well, like in Bosnia. So it's a reminder, I suppose, of shifting gender and how, obviously it has to change by war. But it almost makes a lie of this word reconstruction, because what are we trying to reconstruct? It's always something new in the end. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just thinking about Lerna's work. I mean, her work is brilliant. And those who were affected from genocide, Armenians in Istanbul, intellectuals were affected, but they were still people who stayed in Istanbul. But how genocide also changed them, it is obvious. And yes, interestingly enough, they were for collecting, for example, these orphans whose origin was not clear, or orphans coming from mothers who were raped and they abandoned these children. And it is very astonishing how Armenian community and Armenian church responses to this. They collected these kids, they were baptizing them, they were mixing them with other Armenian orphans, and raising them as Armenians, giving them these Armenian names from Armenian history. And and we see that, for example, if in Bosnian case, we have this problematic situation of children coming from rape. We see how Armenians were trying to solve it, like not making them visible in any way. And trying to accept them as Armenians. And yes, geopolitical, all this, yes. Armenian Patriarch Zavender Haroyan, he knew that he has, Armenian delegations knew that they have to show numbers, but at the same time, how they were taking care of these children also, it is interesting, and it is, so something that other communities who went through genocide could learn. Back in 2017, I was in Venice School of Human Rights when I met Yazidi women survivors, and so Yazidi community members, and they were asking particularly, for example, how Armenians were dealing with these issues and how they overcome it. And I was sharing my research, and I was hoping that also because it was very new for them and they were facing it the same almost the same problems. So it was, yeah, I mean, I guess it was useful for them to learn how Armenians were dealing with the issue. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree. I was thinking about Rwanda, again, facing such a similar issue, and it's the same thing, isn't it? It's kind of, these questions of identity and, I mean, what now we call race, I don't know, quasi-social Darwinist ideas about race that were circulating in, the Ottoman Empire at this time are actually being negotiated down at a family level. That's the point where it makes this kind of impact. And you've shifted the conversation nicely towards the question of children and age, I think. You were talking a bit about regionalism and class earlier, and those are important and often forgotten as well. But women are not just women of any age. Same for men. We can talk a little bit about children. I'm also curious whether your sources mention older people much. That I think is a big silence in everything that I've seen. Perhaps it's because they didn't survive as much, and there was less of a kind of, well, harder for them to leave sources behind for historians. Perhaps they perished more quickly, but that's something I think we could perhaps talk about a bit. But maybe you want to kick off with children. I mean, what role does gender play in terms of children's experience of genocide?
Mm-hmm. So, as I've mentioned, as we talked, Armenian genocide was very gendered from the very beginning, and it also, it also about children from the very beginning. If you have a male child, most probably he's going to be killed than to be saved, or these women who were forced to marry or to choose to marry a Muslim man, if they had to try very hard to convince their new husbands to keep their boys from the Armenian marriage, because most of the time these boys would be deported. And as it is known from history, Turkish state organized special orphanages for these boys for a certain age. They were converted to Islam. They could not, they didn't have names in the beginning. They had just numbers. We read Garnikvanyan's memoirs about Ain Tura and how they were converted and what they went through as and of course, we know from the Ottoman history the practice of devshirme. So I guess it was the same practice that they were raising these boys without any national belonging, without nationality. They were just those who would become the Turkish patriots, would serve the Turkish state. And those boys who were old enough to remember, they somehow they survived and they come back to Armenian community, but there were many who could not remember and who they were, and they just became Muslims. They just became part of a Muslim household. They became Turks, Kurds, and for women, for girls, it was different. They could be, they could, be in the Muslim household, be raised as Muslim girl, and be married to Muslim men. And also because of this reproduction, that was also very important for Ottoman state. That's why they were keeping girls. This was and when we read about the life in concentration camps, again, we see this, that girls would survive. Child prostitution was also common, but boys would be killed and starved. So.
It says a lot about the kind of understandings of how malleable someone's identity is, and that men of a certain age cannot be accepted and can never kind of be integrated into the Turkish nation, whereas women and girls can be forced to in some ways, or you know, physically or otherwise. So yeah, I think that's important. And I like that you brought up about the orphanages. I was thinking on this question about boys' memoirs specifically. I've been reading some. And at the Institute, we republished Semelian's I Ask You, Ladies and Gentlemen. And so reading some of these, I think having worked first on women and girls, and seeing the ways that they do what they can with the agency they have, but it's not much. But reading these boys' memoirs specifically, you see the way that boys have so much more latitude when they're young enough. They're describing on the deportation columns how they can scamper up the hill and see what's coming next, and they can then go back and tell everybody. And if there's a slave market, they can kind of escape. And the fact that they're then walking back along a road towards their village as a boy is not questioned, or has fewer consequences than if they were a girl, for obvious kind of reasons. But I think when we talk about children, we often don't kind of differentiate enough as well, and just think about the different kind of options open to people as they kind of go through this. So yeah, I think that's overall, I think what we get here is the gender lens, that we can take to look at any genocide, but this one too, really allows us into regional understandings. It allows us to think about what the perpetrators are thinking and doing at different levels and how it actually works. The Turkish state wants the demographic disappearance of Armenians, either through death or absorption, but at the level of the Turkish officer who knocked on your grandmother's door, it works as a motive for him as well. It allows us to see these agencies. It allows us to think about resistance. So, it makes us think about reproduction and how that is the foundation of any group that's based on kind of nationality or religion or identity, and how that's interrupted or diverted. So for me, those are the things that make this worthwhile, and it allows us to see a reasonably familiar process anew. Is there something I've forgotten? Is there a different perspective for you?
I was just thinking about when we talked about boys and girls, you have already mentioned, so women, girls were target also for sexual assault, as you know. And I would love to mention also how this was used to terrorize the Armenian community, and in different ways, violating 6-8 years old girls in front of their community, and or women within Armenian churches in front of everyone, also, or crucifying these women after raping them, and making this the rest of the community to accept what perpetrators would offer, for example, marriage, or to go with them, to become their slaves, but with this way to escape the fate that others went through, that they witnessed. This aspect of the Armenian genocide was not that well studied, and especially when we talk about rape being a weapon of genocide, we see how it works on the Armenian case, and it was really used of genocide as a way of destruction. When we read the memoirs of survivors, how they felt after not, they were kind of removed from their own community in the way what they went through, and they became both foreign for their community and also, I mean, for perpetrators, of course, but they became at that moment how they became no one. It is also kind of a way to destroy and not leave them a chance to think about coming back or reconstructing or so, and many women felt that way. But many also knew that it was not their fault, so they would encourage those who went through it to not give up, to not commit suicide, for example, convincing them that, you know, this is not your fault, this is what they want you to do, so this is their goal, so we have to survive, our survival will be our revenge. It is also very interesting to see in genocidal process, as we talk about women and their agency and making decisions and taking the kind of a leading position to lead the communities, a community to survive. So it is also, I mean, this part of Armenian genocide history was, for me personally, was very astonishing to discover. And the way how these women after the genocide became the core, I mean, to rebuild Armenian society, to sometimes to ignore their personal life, because I mean what they went through, to agree to remarry, to become mothers because it was necessary. It is also, I mean, we see like both those who didn't want to come back, those who, you know, want, I mean, to disappear, but also those who went through all of this, but willingly they want to come back and they want to reconstruct, they agree to marry, to have new children, to reconstruct, to preserve an Armenian identity somehow. So,
and the acceptance of men of that as well. I mean, maybe you can give me some detail here that I don't have, because it's normally said that, you know, sexual violence during genocide destroys a community because it traumatizes the women in very obvious ways, but the men feel emasculated because they couldn't protect their women. That's the kind of general argument about, you know, sexual violence in war and genocide. In my sources, which were all kind of from outside of humanitarians, really, and they all have an agenda, which is to show that it's working nicely and please can we have more funding, is that Armenian men were very happy to marry these women. And it's a very kind of rosy kind of situation that's portrayed there. Clearly some did and so on, but what's your perspective on, you know, Armenian masculinity and how that was kind of affected by the genocide? For, you know, it's difficult because of the survival of men, you know, Ottoman Armenians and the communities mostly outside what's now Turkey that, you know, women are then in. But I wonder what your thoughts on that are.
So men, those who survived genocide, I mean, they tried to start new families, also because community were pushing them, and also because it was easier to survive if you have, I mean, if you have a family than to survive alone, by the way, financially and I have to say that many Armenian men who, for example, were immigrants in the US or somewhere, they were willing to marry these women because they lost their families and they knew what these women went through, and they were willing to marry these women to protect them now in this new, in new family, because I mean, again, I will bring the example of Arpine Haroyan, who was an immigrant from Yerzhanka. He went to the US. He was very successful businessman when a war started, and it was in 1916 that all these horrible stories reached him. He was reading newspapers and he found out what happened with Armenians, with his relatives, and as many Armenians were trying to come back to help their families, to find out what happened to them. He was among them, but because he was over 50, he could not join, for example, French forces. So what he did, he became the rescuer of Armenian women and children. And while he was rescuing, he organized this temporary shelter for Armenian women. And once it was attacked by these ex-husbands from whom he rescued these women. So they attacked this shelter and they kidnapped women from there. So he was shocked so that he could not save them, and he didn't know what's going to happen with these women after they were taken. And he was advocating, he was going from one place to another, like for fundraising, but also he was trying to convince Armenians who are not married to come to marry these orphans, these women, to save them, to take them away from that place, and that to save them, and many would go. And you might remember from Karen Yepes' archive, do you remember the picture? It is taken in somewhere in desert, Armenian men and women group wedding photo. They married.
It's like a mass wedding.
Yeah, mass wedding.
18, 20 couples, I think. Yeah.
Yes, and it was the way to save them. And yes, so many men would there. But the thing is that, again, it becomes very complicated because some men, those who survived, didn't know if their wives survived. So they would rush to marry a girl, and then their wife would show up, and they didn't know what to do. And it was traumatizing, this new wife, because she was an orphan, she was a survivor, and it was very difficult for her, and probably most of them were already pregnant from this man. And this man ended up having 2 wives. So this is why Armenian church was trying to regulate this thing. On one side, they didn't know what to do, really. From one side, they wanted these orphans, these women, to get married, to be saved. From other side, they really didn't know how it's going to end. So some men would choose to go back to their first wives. Some would refuse them. And again, it was really, really very difficult situation for all parties. And yes, so
I know of very similar things that happened in the camps after the Holocaust as well. The impulse to recreate a family, to have some kind of normality that's then kind of broken by the reappearance or the confirmation of disappearance of the people that you love. So I'm going to make one last comment, and then we should go to questions. And the last comment is to draw a connecting line, I suppose, between the thing that you said early on about women as decision makers and how they had to step into that role, and then this language of saving and rescuing afterwards, which puts women back into that box or that position of not being decision makers. I'm just going to leave that alone in the corner for people to think about, and say, Tato, will you come back and kind of just direct us to some of the questions that I know that have been coming through?
Yes, I will. Thank you so much to both of you. A lot of private messages are coming to me as well, saying how interesting and fascinating this conversation is. And
we could go for another hour at least.
I'm sure everyone could listen for hours, because it's so insightful, so thoughtful, and such deep gratitude to both of you for working on such heavy topic, dealing with broken lives, but documenting it's so important. We have a lot of questions, so I'll just go back, start reading some of them chronologically. Manu Hagopian is asking, well, he's saying it's very interesting, Anna. Are the cases of these women and girls documented? And Manuk, I'm not sure which girls and women Anna was talking at that point, but probably about your sources.
The ones kidnapped.
Yes, kidnapped. Thank you, Manuk.
Yes, for those who were rescued, so they were taken to shelters. For example, Karen Yepe, she was the representative of League of Nations. So when they were rescuing a woman, they were taking records of how she was kidnapped, from where, her experience, her health conditions. So we have all this in League of Nations archives. I mean, in Geneva, I worked in that archives, and Becky knows them very well. So, and also we have those Armenians. For example, Aramandonian, who was sitting in Aleppo and taking notes of survivors, because Armenians believed back then to justice, they were collecting evidences, and they were trying to collect all the information that was available. And also, we should not forget about the trials that took place in Istanbul, the young Turkish perpetrators that, I mean, they, it is known that they were going through the trial, and Armenian women who were survivors went to that trials, and they were giving their testimonies, and it is very well, it was, I mean, in daily basis, it was published in the Armenian newspapers, and also in the official Turkish newspaper, Takvimi Vekai. But yes, so we have Armenian Patriarchate, who was sending this special questionnaire to all the survivors, to the communities, to write down what happened to them and how they were saved. And so we have a lot of archives, I mean, on this. We have AGBU archives. We have in Nubarian Library, you can find dozens of pages of this. So, yes.
Thank you, Anna. No, thank you very much for such a detailed answer. And another probably similar question from Noemi Stepan Sarkisyan, who says, thank you for the very interesting discussion. Are there any estimates on the number of Armenian girls and women who were forcibly converted? And what evidence do we have of this other than testimonies and missionaries' accounts?
So Anna Arutshyan gives number about 200,000 Armenian women and children were abducted during the genocide. So this is number that I came across so far. What was the second part of the question? I'm sorry.
Evidence that we have of this other than testimonies or missionary accounts, which is a good question.
Yeah, we have documents, a lot of documents. So missionaries, American missionaries, foreign missionaries were constantly reporting what was going on. We have as I said, the Turkish witnesses who came, who gave their, accounts. We have our Ottoman official documents. We have German archives who very well knew what was happening, and they were reporting all this to their officials. And so.
I mean, they kept reasonably good records on the proportion of Armenians remaining in any one province, if I'm right.
You mean Arpine?
No, I mean generally, not missionaries. I mean the Ottoman officials, right? You know, and the target was always somewhere between 5 and 10% remaining.
Yeah.
Target. That's actually a good question. In that the Armenian women who were absorbed, do you know if they counted as Armenians then or as Turkish? I don't know.
You mean after the genocide?
No, during. Isn't it Fuat Dundar's work on kind of demographics talks about how they were, officials were encouraged to keep records of who was remaining in the province, which Armenian families were spared and so on. And, when too many were remaining, some would be moved on. And it just brought up a question for me of, if an Armenian woman was absorbed into a Turkish family, what would she have been registered on? I don't know. Yeah, pass. Yeah.
I know from my
question.
I know from my provinces because they were so. I mean, for example, in Trabzon province, those who became Muslim wives or became, they were registering them with new names, and they were thinking about. I mean, they were even giving them new birth certificate with the Muslim father and mother names. And this was something that, for example, happened in Trabzon. So these women would testify in the court saying that they changed everything. They were like completely cleaning up our history and saying like, okay, now, so you are this person, you're Fatma, your father was this person, Muslim, because probably they were afraid of someday someone will come and look after them or claim them. So they were. But we also know that Talat Pasha, for example, he was keeping records on Islamized Armenians, because many Armenians would convert families, would convert. And Talat Pasha was very afraid of these Islamized Armenians, so he ordered to deport them at some point when he realized that many Armenians are becoming Muslim, and and he was afraid, so he ordered the second wave of Armenian genocide start with this. And so they were, even if they were converted, they were also deported. But these women were already considered as Muslims.
It's an amazing use of bureaucracy.
Yes.
Thank you, and thank you, Naomi, for your question, which we always like our speakers to think about new ideas. Maybe we should come back in a few months' time with some more data. There's a question from Felix Corley. He says, did the question of language make any difference? If many Armenians had Turkish as their native language, did they behave? Were they treated any differently? And further down, I can see that someone disagrees, that saying they were treated everyone based on their background. Language has no effect on treatment. This continues to this day, sadly, we're all aware. What do you two think about this?
My answer is no, not at all. Some Armenians would not know Armenian. I mean, they were completely, they were very much integrated into Turkish society, especially if you look in Cilician part in Adana, for example. Most of them were talking Turkish, they were very much, but at the end of the day, they were all had the same, they had all same fate. So, no.
Yeah. And you see this with other genocides as well. There are kind of caveats or ways that people can, the Jews, for example, were sometimes spared so that they could work. But your phrase "at the end of the day" is perfect here, because at the end of the day they had to disappear one way or another, and language proficiency was not the thing that determined it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sadly. Thank you. Thank you both. There is more of a comment from Anna Arutshyan, who also shared another interesting tweet from a Turkish, very brave MP calling on to recognize the genocide. And Edna's comment is that it is known that many Kurds or Turks living on our ancient motherlands will tell you today that they had Armenian grandmothers. Sad story we heard a lot. Question from Harry Bedevian, who says DNA tests in Turkey began revealing to thousands of Turks that they have Armenian genealogy. Any attempt to increase this test and support their inverted comma coming out, hidden Armenians?
Anna?
Well, I guess because Turkish, Becky mentioned bureaucracy. So we have to know, the Turkish state has, it is very well organized and the bureaucracy works very well, and they have records of everything, and they know, even if you are not saying that you are hidden Armenian, they know. And I am afraid, this is my opinion, that I'm afraid that this politics to make Armenians to come and say that we are Armenians, to somehow to taste these Armenians and target them. We saw what happened in Diyarbakir, in the Armenian church, which was restored there. And now Armenians in a very, very big danger, all these hidden Armenians, I guess. Yes, so I'm sorry, but I do not trust Turkish state, and I don't know. So
perhaps this is a difficult thing to say as well, but sometimes I see when this discussion comes up that the Armenian communities, would like to go in and intervene and do things about this and support. And there's almost a similar dynamic going on that we were talking about earlier of these people are really Armenian, let's save them, or let's bring them back, let's bring them into the Armenian community. And so I think that's why we have to be really careful and difficult and think again about what that person concerned would actually want. Like you were saying, it can be dangerous to acknowledge publicly these sorts of identities, and we have to think about whatever it is that person themselves feels, and identity is a malleable thing.
Yeah.
Thank you. Such difficult issues and topics to answer. Thank you both for working through this. And Nairi says an upsetting topic to touch on, nevertheless very interesting. And I think we'll agree, and however upsetting, we must talk about these things to hopefully make them happen less. And there's a question from Tamara Wilson, who says, considering how the rhetoric of, again, inverted commas, rescuing and saving is abused by the denialist groups, don't you think we must have more male survivors than revealed? And I think she added that also taking into account how purity means so much to Turkish identity. I love the fact that our audience's questions are puzzling us, because well done, everyone.
Yeah, for a good hammering.
Yeah.
The historian's answer is, God, how do we know? If it's not in our sources, we if it's not in our sources, we really, really struggle. And it's difficult because, you know, these are the kind of silences that we work with. And, you know, my article was very much based on silences and, you know, a lack of sources and trying to make something of that. But this is even something that the missionaries don't really differentiate on, don't really think about. And I think probably the same for you, Anna. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, I do not have an answer. Really. We have to have sources.
Mm-hmm.
Tamara says there are some sources. Tamara, would you like to elaborate if I unmute you? Maybe you can add a bit more to this conversation. Let me find Tamara on my list. You can never find people you're looking for quickly. Let's see if Tamara would like to say something herself. No? Okay.
Am I muted?
Now we can.
Can I have my agency?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Yes. Talking about
what
women
happens
rights.
when you ask 3 questions in a row, you get unmuted by magic.
Thank you so much, Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Becky. Great topic to ponder on. While I was doing my PhD, I came across some resources. I think for me the most interesting was Sivaslian's book, Rejects of the Sword. And then there was another source, a child named MK, The Memories of a Child Named MK. And then there was one more, of course, leaving aside the ones we have read of, like Aintura, for example, leaving that aside, leaving institutionalized children's stories aside, because we still don't know about the ones who were at the Adana orphanage, for example. What happened to those children? And I also while again I was researching, I came across an essay by Ayşegül Altınay, a Turkish anthropologist. And she was also talking about how when we look at the scala of narratives, it's mostly women. And it is again being used to help this narrative of Turkish rescuers, Turkish saviors, leaving aside the reality of what was happening. And then when I came across these other additional stories, I thought, yes, actually, when you look at the fact that for Turks or the Turkish state, the Turkic ethnicity to be pure is one of their main arguments. And because it's a patriarchal culture, the lineage passes from the father. So all men in Turkey are Turks, making the descendants more Turkic or undilutedly Turk, if you like. So I suppose both in terms of abusing that rhetoric of saving and rescuing, and leaving aside the perpetrator position of the Turkic people, but bestowing them those heroic positions, it's quite a handy rhetoric actually to just assume all survivors were girls of marriage age. And another thing in Turkish, this really upsets me because it is still the case. When you use the word çocuk or çocuklar, it mostly denotes male child, even though it should be neutral, gender neutral, it still highly means a male child. But even in, for example, Nazan Maksudyan's book, there were photos of boys, and they were talking about how they were doing all sorts of laboring jobs to stay alive. So there is still some evidence, at least we can see, that some boys survived. But when we look at narratives originating from Turkey, all survivors are girls or women. And I think it's also a political thing. Of course, genocide was gender. There are no questions about that. But the fact that this is being manipulated in creating narratives of survival is an additional dimension of continuing the genocide, I think. Thank you.
No, thank you. I think that's super helpful in terms of, I mean, you said, narratives of genocide, and I think that talking about Turkish narratives as opposed to, is really important there, and that's really interesting. So thank you. And I think it also speaks to, again, this point about kind of the slipperiness that's going on here. There's, somehow on the one hand, there's a faith in bureaucracy. If we give this woman a new birth certificate with a different father and a different mother, then bam, stamp, she is Armenian, that's how it is. And at the same time, there's that fear that actually that's not enough. And we have to keep tabs on these identities that aren't really changed. And here again, I think you're right, it's the kids have changed, but not enough, or it's just the women and we can keep control of that and not enough. There's an unease in the success of the project as it goes on. And I think that's, for a genocide historian anyway, who's interested in motives and how perpetrator leaders and communities deal with a process as it's changing, that's something to kind of hold on to.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tamara, and Becky as well for your answer. If you have any last questions, we have a few minutes. Anna and Becky, anything else you'd like to add? Anything else we didn't cover? Anything else you'd like to talk in future events?
I was thinking about what are the gaps still, and I think Tamara's point speaks to something I was thinking yesterday, which is masculinity. I did a quick search for masculinity Armenian genocide on Google Scholar. Nothing almost. There's bits and bobs. Anna, your article pitched up. There's one other that I've yet to read, and that's it. But it's important, and this gender history is not women's history; it's gender history, and so I'd love to start seeing studies of masculinity come through here. We haven't talked about perpetrator gender. That's another thing, sticky to think about sometimes, but and sometimes quite obvious. But in the testimonies that I've read, it's both the Turkish military officer banging on the door and the men, banging on the door or taking women and controlling the households that they go into, and also, village women on deportation routes who take pity on, if we believe the sources who are taking in. So, what are the gender dynamics of that, of perpetration as well? Anna, is there anything else that you think we really need to be kind of focusing on?
I mean, it is very interesting to also, I mean, we are lacking this scholarship that really focus on perpetrators, and I mean, even going back to Gül Altınay, I mean, her work was mentioned. I think, these boundaries of perpetrators and rescuers, it is sometimes very blurred. It really needs to be studied, properly. Thinking about those women who ended up in Turkish household and those Turks calling it as a rescue, I would also question it, like, did these women have an opportunity to come back? These women, did they have an opportunity to tell their stories when they did have this opportunity? How? And were they afraid? I mean, all bunch of stuff. So we cannot say, oh, these families were, rescuers. They were, marrying these women to rescue them. It is a big question mark there. Mm-hmm. And also, yes, when it comes to perpetrators, again, and rescuers, it is really very blurred sometimes. For example, I have read about a man Ismail Bey from Trabzon region, who was hiding Armenian families in his farm, many Armenian families, in the beginning of deportation. And then we see how in the middle of events, he just kills men members of this family somehow, and rapes women. And then after Armenians come with Russians, he basically gives information, collaborates with them to find out other women who were hiding in different places. And so what name you would give this man, and helping with the rescue operations? I mean, after Russians took Trabzon, I mean, Armenians came to save some Armenians who were hiding. So, and he was collaborating, he was helping them. So who was he? I mean, a big question mark. I mean, although I guess we have to study more, we have to ask these questions very often to find out, to give answers. So.
Thank you, Anna. And one last quick question from Felix, who says, what were the gender ratios of children in orphanages?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Gender ratios of children in orphanages, or can you refer to some sources for this sort of data?
My feeling is more male.
Yeah.
Turkish orphanages for the post-war rescues, far more equal. I would say 50-50, if not.
Yeah, I would agree. I was thinking about the sources.
Yeah. Karen Yepper's her rescue home had. Do you know what? I've never done the actual breakdown, partly because some of the books that she used are missing. There are far more women. It's complicated by the fact that they often bring children with them, and some of them are arriving in 1927, so they've got kids of both sexes with them, obviously. So yeah, there are far more women and children being rescued or recovered, whatever language you want to use, after the war, as you kind of expect. But my sense of the Turkish orphanages is that there were more male.
Yes, there were more male, because they were not allowed to. Most of them were not allowed to stay with their mothers, so they were placed in these orphanages. And yeah, and I after the war, all these orphans who were collected also, I mean, because we should not forget about concentration camps, right? And those orphans who ended up in concentration camps, and those they survived. Those who survived, they were collected. And if you go through these documents, I mean, AGBU archives in Cairo has all these documents, because these orphans who were saved, they were placed in special orphanages. So you can go through these documents and see. I mean, I would agree with Becky.
And I saw Tamara nodding as well, which gives me confidence.
Yeah. Looks like there's a lot of interest in actual data and numbers. So here's a research project for you. And to finish, thank you again for this thoughtful, sensitive, very heavy but important topic, as sadly it's so relevant now. It's very sad to realize all the things you're talking about is just happening around the globe. It's not some past fact we can discuss now. But it's important we talk about it, and I truly, truly admire your courage. Every day go and read about this. Every day I feel overwhelmed. My heart is heavy with all the pain you're talking about, all the broken lives and families. So thank you for your time tonight. Becky, we're lucky to have a chair like you and work with us at the Armenian Institute. Anna, I've heard a lot about your work, and we cannot wait for more work from you and Anna Arutshyan, and we discussed many interesting collaborations, so please keep in touch. And I know you and Becky already made some plans. Thank you everyone for joining and your questions and support. Go to our website for our armenianinstitute.org.uk for our new blogs, podcasts, events, a lot happening as always. If you're in London, come and visit us. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.